My name is Holly Carter, and I'm 37 years old. If you met me in person, you probably wouldn't remember much about the interaction afterward. Not because I'm unfriendly, but because I've always been the kind of woman people describe with words like steady, practical, or sometimes quiet. I've worked as a library program coordinator for most of my adult life, organizing reading programs, community events, and school partnerships. It's a job that requires patience and attention to detail, two things that rarely draw much attention. Most people see women like me as dependable background characters in their own stories. I'm the one who remembers birthdays without being reminded, the one who keeps the calendar straight, the one who quietly notices when something is missing and replaces it before anyone has to ask. For a long time, I thought that was enough. My husband, Daniel, used to say that my calm nature was the thing he loved most about me. He'd tell friends that I was the stable one in our relationship. At the time, I believed he meant it as a compliment. Maybe he did, or maybe stability just made life easier for him. For months, long enough that the routine began to feel normal, Daniel came home late almost every night. He had a simple explanation each time: overtime, deadlines, meetings that ran longer than expected. The kind of excuses that make sense when you're married to someone who works in a corporate office. And I believed him, not because I'm naive, and not because I wasn't capable of asking questions. I believed him because trust, to me, always felt like the quieter, stronger choice. Marriage isn't supposed to be an interrogation room. At least, that's what I used to think. Looking back now, I can see the moment the story I believed started to crack. It didn't happen during an argument. There wasn't a dramatic discovery or a suspicious message on his phone. There was no shouting, no confrontation, and no scene that would make for a dramatic television episode. Instead, it happened during a perfectly ordinary afternoon. I met someone who worked with Daniel, a woman who spoke casually, almost carelessly, about something that didn't match the story I'd been hearing every night at our dinner table. It was a small detail. So small, in fact, that another person might have ignored it completely. But when you spend years being the quiet observer in a room, you learn to recognize when a story doesn't line up. That moment didn't give me answers. What it gave me was something more unsettling: a question. And sometimes, a single unanswered question can change the way you see everything that came before it. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or exposing someone in public. Life rarely unfolds that neatly. Instead, it's about something quieter. About what happens when the person everyone assumes will stay silent begins to see the truth clearly and chooses what to do with it. Because the truth is, the most powerful changes in a person's life often happen without anyone else noticing at first. And by the time they do notice, it's usually far too late to change anything. So before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered that a story you trusted, one you heard over and over again, wasn't the full truth after all? Before any of this happened, the version of me that most people knew was very simple. To my coworkers at the library, I was the reliable one. If a school group arrived 30 minutes early, I adjusted the program. If the projector stopped working, I found a replacement. If a parent forgot to sign a permission slip, I calmly found a solution instead of making a scene. I wasn't the person people celebrated loudly, but I was the person they quietly depended on. Reliability has a strange side effect. When you're always steady, people begin to assume you'll always stay that way. At home, the role wasn't very different. Daniel used to introduce me to new acquaintances with the same small smile and a gentle squeeze of my hand. "This is Holly," he would say. "She keeps my life organized." The words sounded affectionate, but they carried a subtle implication. I wasn't the exciting one in the relationship. I wasn't the ambitious one climbing corporate ladders or attending late meetings with important clients. I was the support system, the quiet infrastructure of his life. Our evenings followed a predictable rhythm for years. I would get home first, usually around 5:30. I'd put my bag down, change into something comfortable, and start preparing dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just the kind of meals that feel warm and familiar after a long day. Daniel used to come home around 6. We'd eat together, talk about small things, and sometimes watch an episode of something before getting ready for the next day. It wasn't dramatic, but it was peaceful. Then slowly, that rhythm began to change. At first, it was just once or twice a week. "Big project deadline," Daniel said casually one evening while loosening his tie. "I'll probably be late tonight." It sounded reasonable. Corporate work comes with those kinds of weeks. I remember telling him not to worry about dinner, that I'd leave something in the refrigerator. He kissed my forehead before leaving. A small gesture that reassured me everything was still normal. Over the next few months, those late nights became more frequent. 3 nights a week, then 4. Eventually, it was easier to assume he'd be late than to expect him home on time. Each explanation sounded logical on its own. Quarterly reports. A client presentation. Internal restructuring meetings. The language of office life is full of phrases that sound important but vague enough to avoid further questions. I didn't interrogate him, partly because I trusted him, but partly because of the role people expected me to play. The calm wife. The understanding partner. The one who doesn't make things harder when work is already stressful. Friends would occasionally comment when Daniel canceled plans. "He works a lot, doesn't he?" someone once asked over coffee. I remember smiling and shrugging lightly. "His job gets busy this time of year." The answer felt automatic, like a script I'd learned without realizing it. Daniel never seemed worried about the arrangement. If anything, he looked relieved that I accepted it so easily. Sometimes he'd thank me for being so understanding. At the time, I thought that was what marriage looked like. 2 people adjusting around each other's responsibilities. But there's something people rarely talk about. When someone becomes predictable enough, others stop looking closely at them. Daniel knew I'd be home. He knew dinner would be waiting or stored in the fridge. He knew I wouldn't call repeatedly, asking where he was. From his perspective, I was dependable. From everyone else's perspective, I was supportive. But there was another layer to that perception, one that I didn't fully recognize yet. They didn't just see me as reliable. They saw me as someone who wouldn't question things too deeply, someone who would accept explanations at face value, someone who would stay quiet because that was simply who Holly Carter had always been. And for a long time, they were right. At least, until a very small moment, one that seemed completely ordinary at the time, made me realize that the story I'd been repeating to everyone else might not actually be true. The first moment something felt slightly wrong didn't arrive with a dramatic discovery. It was quieter than that. In fact, if I hadn't always been the kind of person who paid attention to small details, I might have missed it completely. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early spring. Daniel came home later than usual, close to 10:30. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book open in front of me, though I'd been reading the same page for nearly 15 minutes. The house had already settled into its nighttime stillness. The refrigerator hummed softly, and the hallway light cast a long line across the floor. When the front door opened, I heard his familiar footsteps. But something about his energy felt different. Daniel usually walked into the house tired but relaxed after work. That night, he seemed distracted. Not anxious exactly, but slightly rushed, like someone who had just finished a conversation they didn't quite want to continue. "You're still up?" he asked, sounding mildly surprised. I smiled faintly. "Just reading." He loosened his tie and set his briefcase down by the chair. "Sorry again, the meeting ran longer than expected." It was the same kind of explanation I'd heard dozens of times before. And yet, something about the way he said it made me pause. Not because it sounded like a lie, because it sounded rehearsed. The difference is subtle, but when you know someone well enough, you can sometimes hear it in the rhythm of their voice. Still, I didn't question him. Instead, I stood up and walked to the refrigerator. "I left some pasta for you," I said. "It should still be good." Daniel thanked me, warmed it up, and sat at the table across from me. For a few minutes, everything felt normal again. He told me about a difficult client presentation, about numbers that weren't lining up, about a team that had stayed late to fix things before a deadline. It sounded believable. Work stories often do. Then, halfway through his meal, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced down at the screen. Just for a second. But in that second, I noticed something small. The way his hand moved quickly to turn the phone face down. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just quickly, like a reflex. "Everything okay?" I asked casually. "Yeah," he said a little too fast. "Just someone from the office." That answer should have been enough. And technically, it was, but the moment stayed with me after he went upstairs to shower. I remember standing at the sink, rinsing a glass, replaying the scene in my head. The quick movement. The slightly rehearsed explanation earlier. The way he avoided looking at the phone again while we sat there. None of it proved anything. Individually, each detail meant very little. People get work messages late at night all the time. Phones buzz. Meetings run late. None of that is unusual. But sometimes the first sign that something has shifted isn't a major event. It's a feeling, a tiny discomfort that settles somewhere in the back of your mind. A quiet thought that whispers, "That didn't feel quite right." I didn't confront Daniel about it. In fact, I didn't even mention it the next day. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I stayed calm. I trusted the explanation. And I told myself that I was probably overthinking something completely ordinary. But the strange thing about small moments like that is this. Once you notice one inconsistency, your mind begins to watch more carefully. And even though nothing dramatic happened that night, it was the first time I realized that the story I'd been hearing might not be the only version of Daniel's evenings. After that night, nothing changed on the surface. Daniel still left for work around the same time every morning. He still wore the same navy suits, carried the same leather briefcase, and gave me the same quick goodbye kiss before heading out the door. And almost every evening, he still came home late. If you had looked at our life from the outside, you would have seen a couple following a very ordinary routine. A busy professional husband. A patient wife who understood that demanding jobs sometimes meant long hours. But once your mind has noticed something small that doesn't quite fit, you start seeing patterns where you didn't see them before. The late nights were no longer occasional. They were expected. Daniel began texting me in the afternoon with quick updates. "Running late tonight. The meeting went over again. Don't wait up for dinner." The messages were polite and consistent, almost like automated reminders. At first, I appreciated the effort. It felt thoughtful that he kept me informed. But after a while, I realized something subtle. He wasn't really informing me. He was announcing decisions. There was never a question. Never a, "Would you mind if," or "Is that okay with you?" The schedule had simply shifted, and my role was to accept it. Again, none of this sounded dramatic. Marriage often requires flexibility. Work responsibilities change, and partners adjust. That's what I told myself every time another evening passed with an empty chair across from me at the table. Still, small things began to accumulate. One Friday night, we had planned to meet friends for dinner downtown. It was something we had arranged weeks earlier, and I had actually been looking forward to it. Around 6 o'clock, just as I was finishing getting ready, my phone buzzed. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Something came up. "I can't make it tonight." No apology, no explanation, just that sentence. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I typed back, "Okay, I'll tell them you're working." He responded with a quick thumbs-up emoji. That was all. Later that evening, while sitting at the restaurant across from our friends, I noticed how naturally I repeated the same explanation. Daniel got stuck at the office again, I said with a small, understanding smile. No one seemed surprised. In fact, one of our friends laughed lightly. That guy works more than anyone I know. I nodded. Yes, it's been a busy season for them. The sentence came out so smoothly that it almost startled me. I wasn't just accepting the story anymore. I was helping maintain it. Over the following weeks, this pattern repeated itself in different ways. Canceled plans, shorter conversations. Even when Daniel was home, part of his attention seemed elsewhere. His phone buzzed more often. He would glance at it quickly, sometimes stepping into the hallway to take a call. Each time, the explanation was the same: work, deadlines, team issues. Individually, every excuse still sounded reasonable, but there was another shift happening beneath the surface. Something quieter. The late nights weren't just becoming normal. My absence from his schedule was becoming normal too. And the strange part was that no one seemed to question it. Not our friends, not his colleagues, not even Daniel himself. They all seemed comfortable with the version of me that stayed patient, accommodating, and understanding. The woman who didn't make situations complicated. The woman who quietly adapted to whatever arrangement made everyone else's lives easier. For a long time, I believed that was simply part of being supportive, but eventually, a thought began forming that I couldn't quite ignore anymore. Support is something you offer. It isn't something that's quietly expected without discussion. And somewhere along the way, Daniel had stopped asking. There's a moment in many relationships when you begin to understand the role other people have quietly assigned to you. It doesn't happen during a conversation. No one sits you down and explains it. Instead, it reveals itself slowly through patterns, through the way people react when you behave exactly as they expect, and more importantly, how surprised they seem when you don't. For most of our marriage, my role had been very clear. I was the stable one, the person who kept things functioning in the background. Daniel handled the visible parts of life, the career, the networking events, the conversations about promotions and projects. He was the one people described as driven and ambitious. Meanwhile, I was the quiet structure holding everything together. I paid the bills on time. I organized our calendar. I remembered which groceries needed replacing and which friends preferred red wine over white. None of these things was dramatic. They were simply the small mechanisms that make daily life work. Daniel used to say he appreciated it. "You make everything easier," he once told me while we were cleaning the kitchen after dinner. At the time, I thought that was love, but over the years, the phrase started to mean something slightly different. Easier didn't necessarily mean valued. Sometimes it simply meant convenient. The late nights made that role even clearer. The house still ran smoothly. Dinner was still prepared. Laundry still got done. Bills were still paid. From Daniel's perspective, nothing about our life required adjustment, because I adjusted for both of us. One evening, a small conversation made that realization sharper. Daniel had come home a little earlier than usual, around 8. I was folding laundry in the living room while a quiet documentary played on television. He sat down on the couch and sighed. "Today was exhausting," he said. I glanced up. "Long meetings again?" "Yeah, and half the team can't keep up. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only reliable person in that office." The word caught my attention. Reliable. It was the same word people often used for me. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. "You know what I appreciate about you?" he said suddenly. I waited. "You never make things harder when work gets stressful." He meant it as praise. I could hear that in his voice. But something about the sentence lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. "You never make things harder. Not you make my life happier. You make our home feel meaningful. You don't complicate things." That night, as I placed the folded laundry back in our bedroom drawers, I realized something I hadn't fully articulated before. Daniel didn't just see me as supportive. He saw me as predictable. Predictable people are comfortable to live with. They rarely challenge existing arrangements. They don't introduce uncertainty. And because they're so dependable, others often assume they'll always remain that way. That assumption had quietly shaped the dynamic of our marriage. Daniel made decisions. I adapted. Daniel adjusted his schedule. I rearranged mine. Daniel stayed late at work. I kept the house running so he didn't have to think about it. None of this had been discussed directly, but the expectations were clear. And once you see the role you've been placed in, it becomes difficult to ignore it. Not because it's necessarily unfair, but because you begin to ask a different question. If you stopped playing that role, even slightly, would anyone notice? Or would they simply assume you'd return to it the next day? At that point, I still wasn't planning to change anything. But for the first time, I understood the part I had been cast in. The quiet wife, the steady presence, the woman who would always keep things running smoothly, no matter what. The change didn't begin with a discovery. It began with a moment of stillness. One Saturday morning, Daniel had already left the house before I woke up. That wasn't unusual anymore. Weekend work had become another quiet addition to his schedule over the past few months. His message sat on my phone when I checked it. Early meeting with the team. Back later. I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down on the kitchen counter. The house felt unusually quiet that morning. Normally, I would have filled the time automatically, starting laundry, organizing something that didn't really need organizing, preparing breakfast for two, even if only one of us would eat it right away. But that morning, I didn't move. Instead, I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Outside, the street looked ordinary. A neighbor walked her dog past the mailbox. Someone across the road loaded grocery bags into the back of their car. The world was continuing with its usual rhythm. And for the first time in a long while, I noticed something simple. My life had slowly rearranged itself around Daniel's schedule. Dinner times had shifted. Weekend plans had disappeared. Even quiet evenings at home had begun to revolve around the possibility that he might walk through the door late. None of those changes had been dramatic enough to question on their own. But sitting there with my coffee, I realized something that felt oddly calm rather than upsetting. I had adapted so gradually that I hadn't stopped to ask whether the arrangement still worked for me. That realization wasn't angry. It wasn't even particularly emotional. It felt more like stepping back from a painting and suddenly seeing the entire image instead of just one small corner. Later that afternoon, I walked to a nearby bookstore cafe, something I used to do often before life became more centered around Daniel's unpredictable schedule. The place hadn't changed much. Soft music played quietly. A few people typed on laptops near the windows. The smell of coffee and paper filled the room in that familiar way that always made me feel comfortable. I ordered tea and sat at a small table near the back. For a while, I simply read. No phone notifications. No checking the clock to estimate when Daniel might return. Just quiet time that belonged entirely to me. Halfway through the afternoon, a strange thought crossed my mind. When had I stopped doing this? Not the reading specifically. The choosing. Choosing how to spend my time without subconsciously adjusting it around someone else's schedule. The answer was difficult to pinpoint. It hadn't happened suddenly. It had happened gradually, through small accommodations that felt reasonable in the moment. But sitting there in that cafe, something inside me shifted slightly. I realized that patience and silence are not the same thing. Patience is a conscious decision. Silence can sometimes become a habit. For months, I had been silent about the changes in our life, not because I was afraid to speak, but because the situation never seemed serious enough to address directly. But silence has another effect. It gives people room to assume everything is fine. That afternoon, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't send messages asking where he was or why his schedule had changed so much. Instead, I finished my tea, bought a second book I probably didn't need, and walked home slowly through the neighborhood. Nothing about that day looked dramatic from the outside, but internally, a quiet adjustment had taken place. For the first time, I wasn't simply reacting to Daniel's routine. I was beginning to observe it. An observation is a subtle but powerful shift, because once you start watching a situation clearly, you begin noticing things you didn't see before. After that Saturday, I didn't suddenly become a different person. From the outside, everything about my behavior still looked exactly the same. Daniel continued working late. I continued managing the house, the schedules, the quiet routines that kept daily life moving without friction. But internally, something had shifted in a way that even I didn't fully understand at first. Before, my silence had come from habit. Now it came from choice. That distinction is subtle, but it changes the way you see things. When silence is a habit, you move through situations almost automatically. You accept explanations without examining them too closely. You adjust around other people's decisions because that's simply what you've always done. But when silence becomes a choice, you begin listening differently. You notice pauses in conversations. You hear the exact wording people use when they explain something. You start paying attention to patterns. Daniel didn't notice the change. Why would he? From his perspective, I was behaving exactly as I always had. One evening, he came home around 9:30. I was sitting on the couch with my laptop open, organizing a schedule for the library's upcoming summer reading program. "Still working?" he asked while loosening his tie. "A little," I said calmly. He walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. "Did you eat already?" "Positivamente." "Yes." "Saitama-san." "Good," he replied. Today was another long one. I closed the laptop and looked up at him. "Big deadline coming up?" "Yeah," he said, pulling out a container of leftovers. "The whole team's been staying late." The sentence sounded identical to dozens of others he had said before. But this time, instead of simply nodding, I noticed something else. Daniel had stopped providing details. In the past, he used to mention specific projects or people from his office. Sometimes he'd describe presentations or difficult meetings. There were names, stories, and little moments that made his explanations feel personal. Now the language had become more general. The team, deadlines, work stuff, broad phrases that didn't invite follow-up questions. Again, that observation didn't prove anything, but it did reinforce something I had begun to understand. When someone believes they won't be questioned, their explanations often become simpler over time. That evening, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table while eating. "You're quiet tonight," he said after a moment. I smiled slightly. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting the answer immediately. That moment told me something important. Daniel wasn't uncomfortable with my silence. He was comfortable because of it. In fact, the more I remained calm and uncurious, the easier it seemed for him to continue exactly as he had been. For a while, I wondered if that realization would make me angry. But strangely, it didn't. Instead, it made me curious. Curiosity is a quieter emotion than suspicion. It doesn't rush toward conclusions. It simply watches. Over the next few weeks, I continued living our routine exactly as before. I cooked dinner. I asked polite questions about his day. I listened to the same explanations about late meetings and demanding clients. But internally, I had stopped accepting the story automatically. I was observing it. Not searching for evidence. Not preparing for confrontation. Just noticing. And the more closely you observe something, the clearer its structure becomes. Daniel thought my silence meant nothing had changed. What he didn't realize was that silence can sometimes mean the opposite. Sometimes it means someone is paying very close attention. One of the advantages of being perceived as quiet is that people rarely watch you closely. When someone is loud, Ambitious or confrontational, others tend to monitor their reactions. They expect conflict, so they stay alert for it. But when someone is calm and predictable, people relax around them. They assume nothing is changing. That assumption gave me something I hadn't expected. Space. Not the kind of space that comes from distance, but the kind that comes from being overlooked. Daniel didn't suddenly start revealing secrets. Nothing dramatic happened that would have immediately explained his late nights or the subtle shifts in his behavior. Instead, I began noticing smaller things. Patterns. For example, Daniel's late meetings almost always happened on weekdays, but strangely, they often ended around the same time, between 9:30 and 10:30. At first, that detail meant nothing, but the consistency stood out. Corporate deadlines rarely follow such neat schedules. I also noticed how his explanations had simplified over time. The stories about complicated presentations and difficult clients had gradually disappeared. Now most evenings were described with the same vague phrases. Busy day. Long meeting. The team had to stay late. Kinesis. There was nothing technically wrong with those explanations, but they were strangely interchangeable. One night, while organizing receipts in the living room, I realized something else. Daniel's work calendar was still synced to the tablet we kept in the kitchen. It had always been there for practical reasons, so we could coordinate schedules and plan dinners or weekend events. I hadn't looked at it in months, not intentionally, just out of habit. But that evening, as the screen lit up with a notification, I glanced over. The calendar showed a few meetings during the day, morning check-ins, an afternoon presentation, then nothing after 6 o'clock. I stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. That still didn't prove anything. Many people don't list every meeting on a shared calendar. Still, the details settled quietly into the growing collection of observations in my mind. I didn't confront Daniel about it. In fact, I didn't change my behavior toward him at all. That was part of what made the situation so unusual. Instead of reacting emotionally, I began doing something much simpler. I paid attention. Over the next few weeks, I started keeping small mental notes about things that previously would have slipped past unnoticed. The time he left the house. The time he returned. On which evenings did he mention specific coworkers? On which evenings didn't he? Again, none of this involved searching through his phone or investigating anything directly. It was more like quietly observing the structure of a routine that had once felt completely ordinary. And slowly, a pattern began to appear. Daniel's late nights were remarkably consistent, too consistent to be random over time. There were also certain days when he seemed more relaxed than others, almost relieved, like someone who had completed something satisfying rather than exhausting. Those evenings, he came home slightly earlier, sometimes around 8, and on those nights, he was noticeably more attentive. He'd ask about my day. He'd sit with me longer before checking his phone. At first, I wondered if I was imagining the difference, but the pattern repeated enough times that it became difficult to ignore. What fascinated me most wasn't the possibility that something unusual was happening. It was how completely invisible my observations were. Daniel behaved exactly the same way he always had, because he believed nothing had changed. From his perspective, Holly was still the quiet wife who trusted his explanations without question. The dependable woman who kept the house running smoothly and never complicated things with unnecessary suspicion. And in many ways, that perception was still accurate. I wasn't confronting him. I wasn't accusing him of anything. I was simply watching. What Daniel didn't understand was that observation has its own kind of power. Not dramatic power, not aggressive power, just clarity. And clarity has a strange effect. Once you see the pattern clearly enough, the next step in the story often reveals itself without you having to force anything at all. The moment that finally shifted everything didn't happen at home. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, in a place that had nothing to do with Daniel's office. I had taken the day off from the library to attend a small community literacy event hosted at a nearby bookstore cafe. It was the kind of event I often helped coordinate: local teachers, volunteers, and a few organizations discussing ways to encourage reading programs for younger students. Nothing about it felt unusual. The room was warm and softly lit, filled with quiet conversations and the low sound of coffee cups being placed on wooden tables. I was standing near a shelf of new releases, speaking with one of the school coordinators, when someone behind me said a name I hadn't expected to hear. "Daniel is in your department too, right?" I turned slightly. Two women stood near the counter, both wearing business casual outfits that suggested they had come directly from work. One of them looked familiar in the vague way that people sometimes do when you've seen their faces before, without knowing exactly where. The other woman nodded. "Yeah, same floor," she said casually. "Though I hardly see him these days." The first woman laughed softly. "Probably still doing those late nights. Half the team disappears by 6. Something in that sentence made my attention sharpen. Not dramatically, just enough that I stayed where I was instead of walking toward the exit as I had planned. The second woman took a sip of her drink. "Honestly, most people leave around 5:30 lately. Management's been pushing everyone to go home earlier, unless there's a big client deadline." The first woman raised her eyebrows. "Really? I thought Daniel was still working late almost every night." "Not at the office," the other woman replied with a small shrug. "I haven't seen him there past 6 in weeks." The conversation continued for a few seconds after that, drifting to another topic. Something about an upcoming project. I wasn't listening anymore. Instead, I stood very still. Not because I felt shocked. Oddly, the feeling that settled over me was closer to recognition. Like hearing the final piece of a sentence that had been slowly forming in the back of your mind for months. The woman who had spoken turned slightly then, and our eyes met briefly. There was a flicker of polite recognition. "You're Holly, right?" she asked. "Daniel's wife?" Her tone was friendly, completely unaware of the small shift her earlier comment had created. "Yes," I said calmly. "I've seen your photo on his desk," she continued. "I'm Marissa. I work in marketing on the same floor." We spoke for a few minutes after that. Nothing dramatic. She mentioned a recent office update, a charity event the company had sponsored, and a few general details about the building. Everything she said sounded normal, casual, harmless. But one fact had already settled quietly into place. Daniel wasn't staying late at the office, at least not in the way he had been describing. Marissa had said it without hesitation, without any sense that the information might contradict something else. Which meant, from her perspective, it wasn't a secret. It was simply a detail. The kind of detail coworkers mention casually because they assume everyone already knows it. I left the bookstore cafe about 20 minutes later. The afternoon air outside felt cooler than before. As I walked toward home, I noticed something interesting about my own reaction. I wasn't angry, I wasn't panicked, and I wasn't rushing to conclusions. Instead, I felt something clearer. For months, I had been observing patterns that didn't quite align. Late nights, vague explanations, conversations that seemed carefully simplified. Now, for the first time, there was a piece of information that didn't fit the story Daniel had been telling me. Not proof of anything dramatic, just a quiet contradiction. And sometimes, a single contradiction is enough, because it changes the way every previous explanation begins to look. The conversation at the bookstore cafe stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Not as a dramatic revelation, more like a quiet piece of information that had finally settled into the larger pattern I had been observing for months. Daniel wasn't working late at the office. At least, not most of the time. That fact alone didn't tell me where he was actually going in the evenings. It didn't automatically explain anything. There are many reasons someone might stay out after work without being physically inside the office building. Still, the realization changed the shape of the situation. Because now there were two versions of Daniel's evenings. The one he described to me, and the one that existed somewhere outside that explanation. When I arrived home that day, the house looked exactly as it always did in the late afternoon. Quiet rooms. Sunlight is moving slowly across the kitchen counter. The soft hum of the refrigerator. Everything familiar. I placed my bag down and stood there for a moment, thinking. At that point, I had several possible choices. The most obvious one was confrontation. I could simply ask Daniel where he had really been spending his evenings. The question would be direct, and it would probably force an immediate answer. But confrontation has a strange effect. When people feel cornered, they rarely become more honest. They become defensive. The second option was investigation. I could start searching for evidence, checking his phone, tracking his schedule, asking questions of people who worked with him. Many people might consider that the logical next step. But that approach carries its own risks. Once you begin investigating someone you love, the relationship quietly shifts into something else entirely. Trust dissolves into surveillance. And I wasn't ready for that. The third option was something quieter. Observation. Not passive observation like before. Intentional observation. Instead of demanding answers immediately, I could watch what Daniel did now that I understood the story about late office meetings wasn't accurate. Sometimes, when people believe their explanations are accepted without question, they become less careful over time. They stop thinking about how their behavior appears from the outside. And that was the moment I realized something important. For months, Daniel had been moving through his routine under a very specific assumption. I trusted his explanation completely. If I suddenly challenged that assumption, the entire situation would change instantly. He would adjust. He would become more cautious. And whatever truth existed behind those evenings might become harder to see. Standing there in the kitchen, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Not the calm of avoidance, the calm of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't reacting emotionally to the possibility that something was wrong. I was deciding how I wanted to understand the situation before making any permanent choices. That decision required patience. And patience often looks exactly like silence from the outside. When Daniel came home later that night, around 9:15, I greeted him exactly the same way I always had. "Long day?" I asked. He loosened his tie and nodded. "Another late meeting." I studied his expression for a moment, not searching for guilt, just noticing. Then I smiled lightly. "That sounds exhausting." Daniel relaxed immediately, as if the conversation had confirmed something he expected. That nothing had changed. But internally, something had changed very clearly. I had reached a decision point. Not about the future of our marriage, not yet, but about the way I would move forward from that moment. I would not rush toward confrontation. I would not rush toward conclusions. Instead, I would give the situation space to reveal itself. Because sometimes the most irreversible decisions are the ones you make after you see the full picture. And I wasn't finished seeing it yet. Once I made the decision not to confront Daniel immediately, something interesting happened. Life continued exactly as it had before. From Daniel's perspective, nothing had changed. He still left for work each morning, still sent short messages about late meetings, and still came home after 9 most evenings. And I still greeted him calmly. But internally, my attention had shifted into something more deliberate. Observation is passive. Preparation is not. The first thing I did was something simple. Something I should have done years earlier. I reviewed our financial structure. Daniel had always handled his own salary deposits, while I managed the household accounts. It had seemed like a practical arrangement when we first married. I paid the mortgage, utilities, groceries, and day-to-day expenses from our shared account, while his income flowed through a separate account connected to investments and long-term savings. At the time, the system felt efficient, but efficiency can sometimes hide imbalance. One quiet Sunday afternoon, while Daniel was out working with the team, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and began organizing the financial records we had accumulated over the years. Nothing dramatic appeared. No sudden missing funds. No obvious financial deception. But I did notice something else. Most of the long-term investments were under Daniel's primary management. My name appeared on some documents, but the structure had gradually shifted in ways that favored convenience over equal visibility. Again, none of this meant Daniel had done anything intentionally wrong, but it reminded me of something important. Clarity is valuable, not only emotionally, but practically. Over the next few weeks, I made several quiet adjustments. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor who specialized in long-term planning for couples. I explained that I wanted to better understand our current arrangements and ensure that everything was structured clearly for the future. The conversation was calm and professional. No accusations, no drama, just questions about how certain accounts were organized and what options existed for increasing transparency. At the same time, I began updating other parts of my life that had quietly revolved around Daniel's unpredictable schedule. I reconnected with a few friends I hadn't seen in months. I joined a small weekend book discussion group at the library. I even adjusted my own savings plan, something I had neglected because household finances always seemed handled. None of these changes was large enough to attract attention. Daniel didn't ask about them. From his perspective, our routine was still perfectly stable. He still came home late most nights. He still described vague meetings and demanding deadlines. And I still listened politely, but something subtle had shifted. Before, my life had quietly adapted around his schedule. Now, my schedule was beginning to exist independently of his. Not in opposition, just separately. The most interesting part was how completely invisible these adjustments were. People often imagine that preparation looks dramatic, like someone secretly gathering evidence or planning a confrontation. In reality, preparation is often much quieter. It looks like organizing information, clarifying responsibilities, strengthening parts of your life that had slowly become dependent on someone else's choices. Daniel believed the situation between us was unchanged. He believed the same story about long nights at work was still being accepted exactly as before. And in some ways, he was right. I wasn't challenging him. I wasn't demanding explanations. I was simply making sure that whatever the truth eventually revealed itself to be, I would be ready to face it with complete clarity. The first consequences didn't appear suddenly. They arrived slowly, in ways that were almost easy to miss. For weeks, Daniel continued moving through his routine exactly as before. Late evenings, short explanations about meetings, occasional messages telling me not to wait up for dinner. From his perspective, the system still worked. I stayed calm. I didn't ask difficult questions. The house remained organized and predictable. But what Daniel didn't realize was that something essential had changed. I had stopped structuring my life around his absence. Before, when he said he would be late, I adjusted my evening automatically. I would eat alone, leave dinner in the refrigerator, and spend the rest of the night quietly waiting for the sound of the front door opening. Not consciously, just out of habit. Now, my evenings began to look different. Sometimes I stayed later at the library, helping with community events. Other nights, I met friends for coffee or attended the small book group I had recently joined. And occasionally, I simply spent time outside the house, walking through the neighborhood, or reading in the cafe I had started visiting again. None of these changes was dramatic, but they created a subtle shift in our routine. One evening, Daniel came home around 9:30 and found the house dark. I arrived about 15 minutes later. He was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone when I walked in. "Oh," he said, looking up with mild surprise. "You weren't home." "I met a friend for tea after work," I said calmly, placing my bag on the chair. He nodded slowly. "That's nice." The conversation ended there, but I noticed something small in his expression. Not suspicion, more like confusion. The pattern he had become comfortable with was slightly different now. A few nights later, something similar happened again. Daniel sent his usual message around 6. "Running late tonight." I replied with a simple, "Okay." When he returned close to 10, he found me already asleep. The dinner I had prepared earlier was covered in the refrigerator, but the kitchen lights were off. The next morning, he mentioned it casually. "You went to bed early." "I was tired," I said. He seemed thoughtful for a moment, as if something about the situation didn't quite match his expectations. And that was the beginning of the shift. Not confrontation, not accusations, just a slow change in the structure of our evenings. Daniel had grown used to the idea that my schedule would remain open around his, that the house would quietly wait for his return. But now the rhythm was different. My time no longer revolved around his absence, and while he couldn't yet explain why things felt slightly unfamiliar, he was beginning to notice that something had changed. Daniel didn't react immediately. At first, the changes in our routine were small enough that they could be explained away. A later bedtime, an occasional evening out. A few nights, when I wasn't home, he arrived. None of it looked serious on its own, but patterns have a way of becoming visible over time. After a few weeks, Daniel began noticing that my schedule no longer adjusted automatically around his. One evening, he came home around 9 and found the kitchen empty. No dinner waiting on the stove. No television softly playing in the living room. I returned about 20 minutes later. "Where were you?" he asked casually. "Book group," I said, placing my coat over the chair. He nodded, though the expression on his face lingered a moment longer than usual. "You've been busy lately." The sentence sounded light, but I could hear the curiosity beneath it. "I suppose I have," I replied. The conversation moved on quickly, but from that point forward, Daniel began paying closer attention. A few nights later, he arrived home earlier than usual, around 8. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing notes for an upcoming library event. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I thought you'd be out tonight." I looked up. "Why?" He hesitated slightly, as if realizing he didn't have a clear answer. "No reason. Just seemed like you've had a lot going on." The truth was simple. I had. Not because I was trying to create distance deliberately, but because my life had quietly expanded again. Daniel watched me for a few seconds before loosening his tie and sitting down across from me. For the first time in months, he asked a question he hadn't asked in a long while. "How has work been for you?" I answered honestly, describing the literacy event, the book group, and the new programs we were planning at the library. He listened carefully, almost too carefully, because something about the situation had become clear to him, even if he couldn't yet explain it. The rhythm of our marriage had shifted, and he hadn't been the one controlling the change. A few days later, he came home earlier again. Then another evening. Small adjustments. Subtle attempts to return to a routine that no longer existed. But routines are fragile things. Once they change long enough, simply trying to restore them doesn't always work. Because by that point, something deeper has already shifted. Not in anger, not in conflict, just in awareness. And awareness, once it settles in completely, can make certain versions of the past impossible to return to. Daniel didn't fully understand that yet, but he was beginning to feel it. That quiet realization that sometimes arrives too late. The moment when someone realizes the situation they assumed was stable has already moved somewhere else. The conversation happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening. Daniel came home just after 8. I was sitting at the dining table with a notebook open in front of me, outlining ideas for the library's fall reading program. He placed his briefcase down more slowly than usual. "Holly," he said after a moment, "can we talk for a minute?" His voice wasn't tense, just careful. I closed the notebook and looked up. "Of course." He sat across from me, resting his hands lightly on the table. For a few seconds, he seemed to search for the right words. "You've seemed different lately," he said finally. I waited. "Different how?" I asked calmly. He hesitated. "You've been going out more, busy in the evenings. I guess I just noticed things aren't quite the same." The sentence hung in the air between us. There was no accusation in his voice, just uncertainty. I nodded slightly. "They aren't exactly the same," I said. Daniel studied my face as if trying to read something beneath the words. "Did I do something?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't discussed yet. I considered my answer carefully. For months, I had imagined what this moment might feel like. I had expected anger, frustration, maybe even relief. Instead, I felt remarkably calm. "I think we both adjusted to a routine without really talking about it," I said. He leaned back slightly, listening. "You started working late more often," I continued, "and I organized my life around that schedule." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's true. Work's been demanding." "I know," I said gently. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I added something he clearly hadn't expected. "A few weeks ago, I spoke with someone from your office." Daniel's posture changed almost imperceptibly. "From my office?" he asked. "Yes." I kept my voice steady. "She mentioned that most people leave the building around 5:30 lately." Silence settled across the table. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He simply looked at me, understanding exactly what I had just said without needing anything more explicit. I wasn't accusing him. I wasn't raising my voice. I was simply placing a piece of information in the center of the conversation and allowing him to see it clearly. After a few seconds, he exhaled slowly. "I see," he said. His tone carried something new. Not anger, not defensiveness. Just the quiet realization that the story he had been telling for months had finally reached its limit, and that I had already understood it long before this conversation began. The days after that conversation were surprisingly quiet. Daniel didn't attempt to argue or construct a new explanation. In fact, the absence of excuses was one of the clearest answers I received. Sometimes silence reveals more than any long conversation could. We spoke calmly over the following days, not in dramatic confrontations, but in small discussions about what our relationship had slowly become. There were details about his evenings, explanations about choices he had made, and acknowledgments that certain boundaries had blurred over time. None of it involved shouting. None of it felt theatrical. It felt like two adults finally describing a situation that had already existed for months. What mattered more than the details was something else. Clarity. Once everything had been said plainly, the future became easier to understand. Daniel and I eventually agreed that the life we had built together had quietly moved in different directions long before either of us admitted it out loud. There was no dramatic ending, just a gradual separation of routines, responsibilities, and plans for the future. Some people imagine that moments like this leave anger behind. For me, the feeling was different. It was closer to steadiness. For a long time, I had defined myself by the role others expected me to play. The calm wife, the reliable partner, the person who quietly kept everything running smoothly. And there is nothing inherently wrong with being dependable. But I eventually realized that reliability should not mean disappearing into someone else's version of life. Over the past months, my world had quietly expanded again. The library programs had grown. The book group had become a weekly habit I genuinely enjoyed, Friends I hadn't seen regularly in years were suddenly part of my routine again. Piece by piece, my time had become my own. When I look back now, the most important change wasn't discovering the truth about Daniel's late nights. It was discovering something about myself. I learned that calmness doesn't have to mean silence, and patience doesn't have to mean accepting whatever situation appears in front of you. Sometimes strength looks exactly like the person everyone underestimated. The quiet observer, the woman who watches carefully, understands the full picture, and then calmly decides what kind of life she wants to live next. That woman is still me, but now I understand her much better than I used to. Looking back on everything now, the most surprising part of this story isn't the late nights or even the conversation I overheard at the bookstore cafe. It's how quietly everything unfolded. When people hear about situations like this, they often imagine dramatic moments, arguments, accusations, or some kind of explosive confrontation where everything finally comes out at once. But life rarely works that way. Most important turning points happen much more quietly. A small inconsistency. A detail that doesn't match the story you've been hearing. A moment when you realize you've been adapting to a situation for so long that you forgot to ask whether it still feels right. For me, the lesson wasn't about catching someone in a lie. It was about understanding the difference between trust and silence. Trust is something you give willingly. Silence, however, can slowly become something else. A habit that allows problems to grow unnoticed because no one pauses long enough to examine them. I also learned something about perception. For years, people saw me as the quiet one, the calm, dependable woman who kept life organized in the background. And in many ways, that description was accurate. But quietness doesn't mean someone isn't paying attention. Sometimes the person who says the least is the one observing the most. The truth is, I didn't change into a stronger person during this experience. I simply recognized the strength that had already been there all along. The ability to stay calm, to observe carefully, to make decisions without rushing toward anger or revenge. Those qualities aren't dramatic, but they are powerful. Because clarity, real clarity, doesn't need loud reactions to make its point. It only needs honesty. And sometimes the most important honesty is the kind you give yourself. Today, my life feels quieter in a different way. Not empty, just more intentional. My time, my routines, and my choices belong to me again. And that feeling is something I value far more than the version of stability I once believed I had. But I'm curious about something. If you had been in my position, hearing the same explanations for months, and then discovering one small detail that didn't fit the story, would you have confronted the situation immediately? Or would you have done what I did, and waited quietly to see the full picture first?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.